In the annals of military history, there are moments when a single bullet can alter the fate of thousands. When conventional wisdom says someone will fail, when every odd is stacked against them, when their own commanders doubt their abilities, that's precisely when legends are born. This is the story of Maria Santos, a young woman from a small farming village who was never supposed to make it past basic training, let alone become one of the most feared snipers in modern warfare. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most desperate circumstances, and that one perfectly placed shot can mean the difference between victory and devastating defeat. What you're about to read isn't just about marksmanship or military tactics. It's about the power of determination when everyone expects you to quit, the strength found in silence when the world is screaming around you, and the moment when all your training, all your doubts, and all your hopes converge into a single, life-changing decision. Maria's journey from dismissed recruit to siegebreaker will show you that sometimes the most important battles aren't won by the strongest or the fastest, but by those who refuse to accept that failure is inevitable. Maria Santos had always been small for her age, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with thin arms that seemed too delicate to carry anything heavier than a book bag. Growing up in the rural village of San Miguel, she spent her days helping her father tend to their small farm, where her keen eyesight proved useful for spotting diseased crops from across the fields. Her mother often joked that Maria could see a needle in a haystack from 100 yards away, but nobody in their quiet farming community ever imagined that this gift would one day save hundreds of lives. The war had been raging for 3 years when it finally reached their province. Maria was 22 years old, working as a schoolteacher in the village elementary school, when the first bombs fell on the nearby city of Santa Rosa. Within weeks, refugees began streaming through San Miguel, bringing with them horrifying stories of destruction and death. The enemy forces were advancing rapidly, overwhelming the National Army with superior numbers and equipment. When the recruitment officers arrived in San Miguel, they were looking for young men to join the fight. Maria surprised everyone, including herself, by stepping forward to volunteer. The recruiting sergeant, a weathered man named Carlos Mendez, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. Her small frame and quiet demeanor didn't exactly scream soldier material to him. "Young lady, we appreciate your patriotism, but perhaps you'd be better suited for nursing or communications," Sergeant Mendez said, trying to be kind but clearly dismissive. "The front lines are no place for someone like you." Maria's father, Vicente Santos, stood nearby with worry etched across his weathered face. He had lost his own father in the previous war and couldn't bear the thought of losing his daughter to this one. "Maria, please reconsider. The farm needs you. The children at school need you. Let the soldiers do the fighting." But Maria had seen something in the eyes of the refugees that haunted her. She had watched mothers clutching their children, speaking of entire families wiped out by enemy snipers who picked off civilians from impossible distances. She had heard stories of enemy marksmen who could hit targets from over 1,000 yards away, spreading terror wherever they went. Something deep inside her told her that she had a role to play in stopping this nightmare. "I'm not asking to be a nurse or a radio operator," Maria said firmly, looking directly at Sergeant Mendez. "I want to learn to shoot. I want to be trained as a sniper." The entire recruitment station fell silent. Several men in line began to chuckle, and even some of the other officers exchanged amused glances. The idea of this tiny schoolteacher becoming a sniper seemed absurd to everyone present. "Listen, miss," another officer interjected. "Sniping isn't just about having good eyes. It requires incredible physical strength to handle the equipment, the mental toughness to take a life from long distance, and the ability to survive for days in hostile territory. No offense, but you look like a strong wind could knock you over." Maria's cheeks flushed red, but she stood her ground. She thought about her grandfather, who had been a hunter and had taught her to shoot when she was just 8 years old. She remembered the countless hours they had spent together in the mountains, learning to track animals and hit targets at distances that amazed even him. Most importantly, she remembered his words, "Maria, shooting isn't about muscle. It's about patience, breathing, and seeing what others cannot see." "Give me a chance," she said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. "Let me prove myself on the shooting range. If I can't hit what you want me to hit, I'll accept whatever role you think is appropriate." Sergeant Mendez sighed heavily. He had been recruiting for 2 decades and had seen many young people with unrealistic expectations about military service. However, there was something about Maria's quiet confidence that intrigued him. Against his better judgment, he decided to humor her. "Fine," he said. We'll take you to the basic training camp and you can try out for sniper school. But when you wash out, and you will wash out, you'll accept assignment to the medical corps without complaint. Deal?" Maria nodded, knowing that this might be her only chance. The bus ride to Camp Rodriguez took 6 hours through winding mountain roads. Maria sat quietly while the other recruits, all young men, talked loudly about their expectations of glory and heroism. Many of them were clearly excited about the prospect of combat, making grand statements about how they would single-handedly turn the tide of the war. At the training camp, Maria quickly realized that Sergeant Mendez hadn't been exaggerating about the physical demands. The first week of basic training was brutal. Morning runs that left her gasping for breath, obstacle courses that seemed designed to break both body and spirit, and physical training sessions that pushed every recruit to their absolute limits. Maria struggled with many aspects of basic training. She couldn't do as many push-ups as the male recruits, she was slower on the runs, and she had trouble with some of the heavier equipment. Several times, she overheard instructors discussing whether she should be transferred to a support role immediately. But there was one area where Maria began to shine: marksmanship training. On the shooting range, something magical happened. When Maria picked up a rifle for the first time in basic training, it felt natural in her hands. Her breathing automatically slowed, her heartbeat seemed to steady, and the world around her became crystal clear. While other recruits struggled to hit targets at 200 yards, Maria was consistently hitting bullseyes at 300 yards with iron sights. Sergeant Rodriguez, the marksmanship instructor, began paying special attention to Maria's performance. He was a former sniper himself, with over 15 years of experience, and he recognized something special when he saw it. After her third consecutive perfect score on the range, he approached her privately. "Santos, where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, genuinely curious. "My grandfather taught me when I was young," Maria replied. "We used to hunt together in the mountains near my village. He always said that shooting was more about understanding yourself than understanding the weapon." Sergeant Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. He had seen natural shooters before, but Maria's instinctive understanding of ballistics and wind compensation was remarkable for someone with no formal training. More importantly, she had the mental composure that many soldiers took years to develop. The other recruits had mixed reactions to Maria's shooting abilities. Some were supportive, recognizing that her skills could be valuable to their cause. Others were openly resentful, feeling that a woman shouldn't outperform men in any military capacity. A few made crude jokes about her abilities, suggesting that she was just lucky, or that the instructors were being easy on her because of her gender. Maria ignored the comments and focused on her training. She knew that every day she remained in the program was another day closer to proving herself worthy of sniper school. She also knew that the real test was yet to come. The preliminary sniper selection process was scheduled for the end of the 6th week of basic training. Only recruits who had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills and mental toughness were eligible to apply. Out of the 200 recruits in Maria's training company, only 12 were invited to participate in the selection process. Maria was the only woman among them. The night before the selection test, Maria lay awake in her bunk, listening to the sounds of the other recruits sleeping around her. She thought about her village, her students, and the refugees she had met. She thought about the enemy snipers who were terrorizing innocent civilians. Most of all, she thought about her grandfather's words about seeing what others could not see. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, asking not for success, but for the strength to give her absolute best effort. Tomorrow would determine whether her military career would continue toward her goal of becoming a sniper, or whether she would spend the rest of the war in a support role, always wondering what might have been. The selection process would test everything she had learned and everything she was capable of becoming. But tonight, she was still just Maria Santos, the small school teacher from San Miguel who everyone said would never make it. Tomorrow, she would begin to prove them wrong. Dawn broke grey and cold over Camp Rodriguez as the 12 sniper candidates assembled at the shooting range. Maria arrived early, as had become her habit, and found herself standing next to candidates who looked like they had been born for warfare. There was Miguel Torres, a former police officer from the capital city with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for never missing his target. Next to him stood Roberto Cruz, a competitive shooter who had won national championships and whose confidence bordered on arrogance. The other men ranged from experienced hunters to military academy graduates, each carrying himself with the kind of swagger that comes from a lifetime of being told you're exceptional. Captain Elena Vasquez, the sniper school commandant, addressed the group with a kind of cold precision that immediately commanded respect. She was a legend in the military, credited with over 40 confirmed kills during her active service, and now responsible for training the next generation of elite marksmen. Her reputation was intimidating, and rumors suggested that she had never passed a female candidate through her program. "Gentlemen," she began, her eyes briefly pausing on Maria before continuing, "and Candidate Santos, you are here because you have demonstrated above-average shooting skills in basic training. However, I want to be absolutely clear about something. Shooting paper targets at known distances in perfect weather conditions has absolutely nothing to do with real sniper work." She began pacing in front of the line of candidates, her boots crunching on the gravel beneath her feet. "A real sniper operates alone or with a single spotter, often behind enemy lines for days or weeks at a time. You will be cold, hungry, scared, and exhausted. You will have to make impossible shots under unimaginable pressure, knowing that missing means not just your own death, but potentially the deaths of everyone counting on you." Maria felt her stomach tighten as Captain Vasquez continued her speech. She had expected the training to be difficult, but the reality of what she was volunteering for was beginning to sink in. "The selection process you are about to undertake is designed to eliminate those who cannot handle these realities," Captain Vasquez said. "By tomorrow morning, most of you will be reassigned to other units. The few who remain will begin the most demanding training program in our military. I expect that this year, like most years, I will graduate between 0 and 2 new snipers from this selection class." The first test was psychological evaluation. Each candidate was required to spend 30 minutes with the base psychologist, Dr. Maria Hernandez, who would assess their mental fitness for the extreme demands of sniper work. The interviews were conducted privately, but Maria could see the strain on the faces of candidates as they emerged from the sessions. When Maria's turn came, Dr. Hernandez studied her file carefully before beginning the interview. "Ms. Santos, I have to ask you directly. Do you understand what it means to kill another human being from long range? You won't see their face clearly, but you'll watch them fall. You'll know that person had a family, dreams, fears, just like you do. How do you think you'll handle that psychological burden?" Maria had prepared for this question, but sitting in the sterile office with Dr. Hernandez's penetrating gaze fixed on her, the reality felt much heavier than she had anticipated. She thought about the refugee children she had taught in her village, about their nightmares of enemy soldiers, about their parents who would never come home. "Doctor, I won't pretend that taking a life will be easy," Maria said carefully. "But I've seen what happens when evil people are allowed to terrorize innocent families. I believe that sometimes stopping one person from hurting many others is not just justified, but necessary. I'm prepared to carry that burden if it means protecting people who can't protect themselves." Hernandez made notes on her pad and continued the interview for another 25 minutes, probing Maria's motivations, her support systems, and her coping mechanisms. When it was over, Maria had no idea whether she had passed or failed. The second test was physical endurance. The candidates were required to complete a 15-mile march through mountainous terrain while carrying full combat gear weighing over 60 pounds. They had 6 hours to complete the course, and anyone who failed to finish within the time limit would be immediately eliminated. Maria knew this would be her greatest challenge. The male candidates had significant advantages in terms of upper body strength and overall size. She would need to rely on her endurance and mental toughness to compensate for her physical disadvantages. The march began at 0600 hours on a misty morning that promised to become brutally hot as the sun climbed higher. Maria positioned herself in the middle of the group, knowing that trying to keep up with the fastest candidates would exhaust her too quickly, but also aware that falling too far behind could be demoralizing. For the first 5 miles, the group stayed relatively together. The terrain was challenging but manageable, winding through forest paths and over moderate hills. Maria found her rhythm and concentrated on maintaining steady breathing and efficient movement. She had learned from her grandfather that endurance was more about pacing than speed. By the 8th mile, the real test began. The path became steeper and more treacherous, winding up a mountainside that seemed to climb endlessly toward the grey sky. Several candidates began to struggle visibly, and Maria could hear labored breathing and occasional curses from the men around her. Miguel Torres, despite his impressive physical appearance, began to fall behind around the 10th mile. His face was bright red, and sweat poured down his face despite the cool mountain air. Roberto Cruz, the competitive shooter, was maintaining his position but clearly suffering. 2 other candidates had already dropped out, unable to continue under the weight of their gear. Maria, meanwhile, had found something approaching a meditative state. The repetitive motion of walking, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and the familiar feeling of being alone in the mountains reminded her of hunting trips with her grandfather. She was tired, certainly, but she felt like she could continue at this pace indefinitely. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the weather began to deteriorate. What had started as a misty morning was turning into a cold, driving rain that made the rocky path slippery and dangerous. Visibility dropped to just a few yards, and the candidates were forced to navigate by compass and instinct. It was during this most difficult portion of the march that Maria began to overtake some of the other candidates. Her smaller size actually became an advantage in the treacherous conditions, as she could maintain her footing more easily on the slippery rocks. Her experience navigating mountain terrain from her hunting days proved invaluable, as she picked safe routes through areas that slowed down the larger men. By the 13th mile, only 7 candidates remained in the race. Maria was now among the front group, along with 2 other candidates who had emerged as the strongest performers. She could hardly believe it herself, but she was not only surviving the march, she was excelling at it. The final 2 miles were the most challenging of all. The path led straight up the face of a nearly vertical cliff, requiring candidates to use their hands as much as their feet to maintain progress. The rain had made every surface slippery and dangerous, and one wrong step could result in a serious fall. Maria reached the finish line with 45 minutes to spare, finishing 3rd out of the 7 candidates who completed the march. She was exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, but she had proven something important to herself and to Captain Vasquez, who was waiting at the finish line with a stopwatch and an expression that revealed nothing about her thoughts. The 3rd and final test was the most important: advanced marksmanship under stress. Each candidate would be required to make 5 shots at increasing distances, with each shot taken after completing a different physical stress test designed to elevate heart rate and disrupt normal breathing patterns. The first shot was taken at 400 yards after completing 50 push-ups. The second was at 600 yards after a 400-meter sprint. The third was at 800 yards after carrying a 150-pound dummy for 200 meters. The fourth was at 1,000 yards after completing an obstacle course. The 5th and final shot was at 1,200 yards after spending 10 minutes in a stress position that left muscles shaking and vision blurred. Maria watched as the other candidates took their turns. Miguel Torres, despite his struggles during the march, proved to be an excellent marksman under pressure, hitting 4 out of 5 targets. Roberto Cruz managed 3 hits out of 5, which was considered respectable given the difficulty of the test. By the time it was Maria's turn, only she and 3 other candidates remained in contention. As Maria approached the shooting line for her first shot, she felt the familiar calm descending over her that had marked all of her best shooting performances. Her grandfather had taught her that the key to shooting under stress was not to fight the physical discomfort, but to acknowledge it and then let it fade into the background while focusing entirely on the fundamentals. Her first shot at 400 yards was a perfect bullseye. The second at 600 yards after the sprint that left her heart pounding was slightly off-center but still well within the acceptable zone. By the third shot, she had found her rhythm completely, and the 800-yard target presented no challenge despite her muscle fatigue from carrying the dummy. The fourth shot, at 1,000 yards after the obstacle course, was where most candidates had begun to fail. The distance was extreme, and the physical stress made it nearly impossible to maintain the steady hold necessary for precision shooting. Maria lay prone on the shooting mat, her breathing still elevated from the obstacle course, and forced herself to slow down everything about her approach. She waited for her breathing to stabilize, took careful note of the wind conditions, and made her calculations for bullet drop over the long distance. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the shot felt perfect from the moment she fired it. Through her scope, she watched the bullet impact dead center on the target. Captain Vasquez, who had been observing each shot through powerful binoculars, made a note on her clipboard but gave no indication of her thoughts. The final shot was at 1,200 yards, a distance that many experienced snipers would consider challenging even under perfect conditions. After the stress position that left her muscles trembling and her vision slightly blurred, it seemed nearly impossible. Only one other candidate had managed to hit the target at this distance, and his shot had barely qualified as acceptable. Maria settled into position behind her rifle and began her pre-shot routine. She took several deep breaths, allowing her heart rate to slow and her vision to clear. She studied the wind flags positioned at various points along the range, calculating how the wind would affect her bullet during its long flight to the target. The math was complex. At 1,200 yards, even a slight miscalculation could result in a complete miss. She had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, and even the rotation of the Earth, which could affect the bullet's path over such a long distance. But as she lined up the shot, everything seemed to fall into place with crystalline clarity. When she fired, Maria knew immediately that it was the best shot of her life. The recoil felt smooth and controlled, and her follow-through was perfect. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's path seem to hang in the air for an impossibly long time before striking the target with a satisfying impact that she could see even at that extreme distance. The shot was not just a hit, it was a perfect bullseye. Captain Vasquez lowered her binoculars slowly, studied her notes for a long moment, and then walked over to where Maria was still lying prone behind her rifle. "Santos," she said quietly. "Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. Bring your gear. You're going to sniper school." As the other candidates were dismissed and began the long walk back to their barracks, Maria remained on the shooting range for a few more minutes, staring out at the distant target that had just changed her life forever. She thought about her grandfather, who had always believed in her ability to see what others could not see. Tomorrow, the real training would begin. Sniper school was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced, even after the intense selection process. Captain Vasquez had not been exaggerating when she described it as the most demanding training program in the military. The school was located in a remote mountain facility that had been specifically designed to simulate the harsh conditions snipers would face in combat situations. Maria found herself as the only woman among 4 students who had made it through selection. The others were Miguel Torres, who had redeemed himself during the marksmanship test, David Kim, a quiet former engineering student whose analytical mind proved perfectly suited to the mathematical precision required for long-range shooting, and Carlos Ruiz, a seasoned sergeant who had volunteered for sniper training after losing his previous unit in a devastating enemy ambush. The first weeks of training focused on the technical aspects of precision shooting. Students learned about ballistics, wind reading, range estimation, and the dozens of variables that could affect a bullet's trajectory over long distances. They studied weather patterns, atmospheric pressure, and even the effects of altitude on ammunition performance. Maria discovered that being a successful sniper required as much scientific knowledge as it did shooting ability. Each morning began before dawn with physical conditioning designed specifically for sniper operations. Unlike basic training, which emphasized general fitness, sniper conditioning focused on the specific demands of remaining motionless for hours at a time while maintaining the mental alertness necessary for split-second decisions. They practiced holding stress positions for extended periods, learning to control their breathing and heart rate even when their muscles were screaming for relief. Captain Vasquez proved to be a demanding but fair instructor. She pushed all of her students to their absolute limits, but she was equally hard on everyone regardless of their background or gender. Maria quickly realized that the captain's reputation for rarely graduating students had nothing to do with arbitrary standards, and everything to do with the life-or-death nature of sniper work. In combat, there are no second chances, Captain Vasquez explained during one of their classroom sessions. When you squeeze that trigger, you have to be absolutely certain that your shot will hit exactly where you intend it to hit. Miss your target, and you've just revealed your position to every enemy soldier in the area. Hit the wrong target, and you might have just killed an innocent civilian or one of your own troops. The psychological aspect of sniper training proved to be the most challenging for Maria. During her 3rd week at the school, the students were required to participate in realistic training scenarios using specially designed paintball ammunition. The scenarios were designed to simulate actual combat situations where snipers might be called upon to take a shot. In one particularly difficult scenario, Maria found herself positioned in a mock village, where actors played the roles of enemy soldiers and innocent civilians. Her mission was to eliminate a high-value target who was meeting with other enemy leaders in a building surrounded by non-combatants. The shot had to be taken through a window at a distance of 800 yards, and she had only one opportunity to get it right before the target would move to a location where a shot would be impossible. As Maria studied the scene through her scope, she could see the target clearly. The actor playing the enemy leader was distinguishable by his uniform and position at the head of the table where the meeting was taking place, but he was surrounded by other actors, some of whom were playing enemy soldiers, and others who were portraying innocent civilians caught in the conflict. The pressure was intense. Maria knew that in a real situation, a missed shot or hitting the wrong target could have catastrophic consequences. She had to account for wind conditions that were constantly changing, the movement of people in the target area, and the psychological pressure of making a perfect shot while knowing that failure meant mission failure. She spent nearly 20 minutes studying the scene, waiting for the perfect moment when the target would be clearly separated from the other people in the room. When that moment came, she had perhaps 3 seconds to line up and take her shot before the target would move again. The shot was perfect. The paintball struck the target precisely where a real bullet would have been instantly fatal, and none of the bystanders were hit. But as Maria watched the target fall, she felt a complex mix of emotions that surprised her, even knowing that this was just training. Even knowing that the person she had just killed would get up and wash off the paint, She felt the weight of what she had done. Captain Vasquez approached her position after the exercise and sat down beside her. "How are you feeling, Santos?" she asked quietly. "Honestly, Captain, I'm not sure," Maria replied. "I know it was just training, but I keep thinking about what it will feel like when it's real. When the person doesn't get back up." "That's exactly the right reaction," Captain Vasquez said. "The day a sniper stops feeling something when they take a life is the day they become dangerous to everyone around them, including their own side. The goal isn't to become emotionless. The goal is to be able to do what's necessary despite the emotional cost, when the alternative is allowing greater harm to occur." As the weeks progressed, the training became increasingly sophisticated. Students learned advanced fieldcraft skills, including how to move undetected through enemy territory, how to construct effective camouflaged positions, and how to survive for extended periods with minimal supplies. They studied enemy tactics and learned to recognize the signs that might indicate the presence of enemy snipers. Maria excelled at the camouflage and concealment aspects of training. Her small size, which had initially been seen as a disadvantage, proved to be a significant asset when it came to hiding in natural terrain. She could construct positions that were virtually undetectable even to instructors who knew approximately where to look for her. During one advanced exercise, students were required to approach within 200 yards of an enemy observation post without being detected, then remain hidden for 6 hours while gathering intelligence on enemy movements. Maria not only completed the approach undetected, but managed to position herself so effectively that when the exercise concluded, it took the instructors 15 minutes to find her, even though they knew her general location. The marksmanship training continued to become more challenging as well. Students progressed from shooting at stationary targets under ideal conditions to hitting moving targets in difficult weather at extreme ranges. They learned to make shots while lying in uncomfortable positions, while wearing gas masks, and while dealing with various forms of stress and distraction. Maria's natural shooting ability, combined with her disciplinary approach to training, made her one of the strongest students in the class. She consistently outperformed her classmates on the range, but more importantly, she demonstrated the mental composure necessary to make difficult shots under pressure. The culmination of sniper school was a final exercise that lasted 1 week and tested everything the students had learned. Each student was given a complex mission that required them to infiltrate enemy territory, establish a concealed position, gather intelligence for several days, and then execute a precision shot under combat conditions. Maria's mission was particularly challenging. She was required to approach within 600 yards of an enemy command post, remain hidden for 3 days while observing and reporting on enemy activities, and then eliminate a high-value target when he appeared for his daily briefing. The area was heavily patrolled, and there would be multiple opportunities for her mission to fail catastrophically. She began her approach during the pre-dawn hours of a moonless night, carrying enough food and water for a week along with her rifle and all necessary equipment. The infiltration route took her through dense forest, across open fields where she had to move with extreme care to avoid detection, and finally into a rocky area overlooking the enemy compound where she would establish her shooting position. The approach took nearly 8 hours, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making any noise or leaving any traces that might alert enemy patrols to her presence. When she finally reached her planned position, she spent another 2 hours preparing her hide site, constructing camouflage that would allow her to remain undetected even if enemy soldiers passed within a few yards of her position. For 3 days, Maria lay motionless in her hide site, observing the enemy compound through her scope and taking detailed notes on their routines and security procedures. She watched as patrols moved through the area at predictable intervals, noting their routes and timing. She identified the various buildings within the compound and began to understand the daily rhythm of the enemy activities. The physical demands of remaining in position for so long were extraordinary. Maria could only move during predetermined windows when she was certain no enemies were observing her area. She had to eat, drink, and even relieve herself without leaving any trace of her presence. Sleep came in brief, fitful periods when the compound activity was at its lowest. On the morning of the 4th day, Maria's target finally appeared. The enemy commander emerged from the main building at exactly 0800 hours, as he had done for the previous 3 days, to conduct his morning briefing with his staff. The range was 584 yards, and the wind conditions were challenging but manageable. Maria had been preparing for this moment for the entire 3 days of observation. She knew exactly where the target would stand, how long he would remain in position, and what the environmental conditions would be at that time of morning. She had calculated the precise adjustments needed for range, wind, and atmospheric conditions. As the target took his position for the briefing, Maria controlled her breathing and began her final pre-shot routine. Everything around her seemed to fade away as she focused entirely on the shot. her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. See what others cannot see. Through her scope, the target appeared perfectly clear despite the long distance. Maria made her final adjustments for wind, settled into her shooting position, and waited for the perfect moment. When it came, her trigger squeeze was smooth and controlled, exactly as she had practiced thousands of times. The shot was perfect. At nearly 600 yards, the training round struck the target with precision that would have been instantly fatal in a real combat situation. Maria immediately began her extraction from the position, moving carefully but quickly to avoid the enemy search teams that would soon be scouring the area for the sniper who had just eliminated their commander. The extraction was successful, and Maria reached the designated rally point without being detected by the enemy forces that were frantically searching for her. When Captain Vasquez met her at the extraction point, the expression on her face was one of unmistakable pride. "Santos," she said simply, "congratulations. You are now officially a qualified sniper." That evening, Maria called her father from the base telephone to share the news that she had graduated from sniper school. Vicente Santos was proud, but also deeply worried about what his daughter's new assignment would mean for her safety. "Promise me you'll be careful, mija," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Your mother and I are proud of what you've accomplished, but we want you to come home safe." Maria promised to be as safe as possible, but she knew that her real test was yet to come. Sniper school had prepared her technically and physically, but combat would test everything she had learned in ways that no training exercise could fully simulate. Within a week, she would receive her first assignment to a combat zone, where enemy forces had surrounded a critical military outpost. The siege had been going on for over a month, and conventional attempts to break through the enemy lines had failed repeatedly. Military commanders were beginning to consider more unconventional approaches to break the deadlock. Maria Santos, the small school teacher from San Miguel whom everyone had said would never make it, was about to face the test that would define her entire military career. Fort Esperanza had been under siege for 38 days when Maria received her deployment orders. The remote mountain outpost, strategically positioned to control access to the Central Valley, housed 847 soldiers who had been cut off from all supplies and reinforcements since enemy forces had overrun the surrounding territory. What made the situation particularly desperate was that Fort Esperanza also served as a refugee center, protecting over 1,200 civilians who had fled from nearby villages as enemy forces advanced through the region. Intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The enemy had positioned approximately 3,000 troops in a complete circle around the fort, making any conventional rescue attempt virtually impossible. Previous relief efforts had failed catastrophically, with 2 entire battalions decimated in unsuccessful attempts to break through the siege lines. Artillery bombardments had proven ineffective due to the enemy's well-prepared defensive positions, and air support was limited by sophisticated anti-aircraft systems the enemy had deployed throughout the valley. The soldiers and civilians trapped inside Fort Esperanza were facing starvation, disease, and increasingly desperate conditions. Medical supplies had run out 2 weeks earlier, and food rations had been reduced to subsistence levels. Perhaps most critically, the fort's water purification system had been damaged by enemy mortar fire, forcing the defenders to rely on rapidly diminishing emergency supplies. Maria's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Mendoza, briefed her on the mission in a secure tent at the Forward Operations Base, located 15 kilometers from the siege area. Colonel Mendoza was a veteran of multiple conflicts, known for her strategic thinking and her ability to find solutions to seemingly impossible situations. "Santos, I'm going to be completely honest with you," Colonel Mendoza said, studying the satellite images spread across the table between them. "This mission has a very low probability of success using conventional tactics. We've tried everything else, and now we're looking at options that most commanders would consider desperate." The map showed the tactical situation in stark detail. Fort Esperanza was positioned on a hill in the center of a valley, surrounded by enemy positions that had been carefully prepared over the course of the siege. The enemy commander had positioned his forces to create overlapping fields of fire that made any approach to the fort extremely dangerous. "What makes this siege particularly effective," Colonel Mendoza continued, "is the enemy commander, General Anton Kozlov. He's a former Special Forces officer with extensive experience in siege warfare. Our intelligence indicates that he's personally directing the siege operations, and that his tactical decision-making has been flawless so far."
Maria studied the photographs of General Kozlov that intelligence had provided.
He was a thin man in his mid-50s, with grey hair and cold eyes that suggested a mind capable of ruthless calculation. According to his dossier, he had successfully conducted similar siege operations in 3 other conflicts, always with devastating effectiveness. Kozlov has established his command post here, Colonel Mendoza said, pointing to a location on the map approximately 1,800 meters from Fort Esperanza. It's positioned to give him visual oversight of the entire siege operation while being far enough from the fort to be safe from their defensive fire. He conducts his tactical briefings every morning at 0730 hours on an observation platform that gives him a clear view of the fort and surrounding terrain. Maria began to understand why she had been called for this mission. The distance from any concealed position to Kozlov's command post would be extreme, well beyond the effective range of most snipers. Moreover, the shot would have to be made across difficult terrain that included significant elevation changes and unpredictable wind patterns. "What's the longest shot you've made in training, Santos?" Colonel Mendoza asked. 1,400 meters, ma'am, under ideal conditions," Maria replied. "But I've consistently hit targets at 1,200 meters under various stress conditions. This shot would be at minimum 1,600 meters, possibly as far as 1,800 depending on where you can establish a position," Colonel Mendoza said. The terrain analysis suggests that wind conditions in the valley are particularly challenging, with updrafts and crosswinds that change direction unpredictably throughout the day. Maria would need to infiltrate through enemy territory, establish a concealed position within range of Kozlov's command post, and make an extremely difficult shot under combat conditions. If she missed, or if she was detected before taking the shot, the enemy response would be swift and overwhelming. "Ma'am, what happens to the siege if Kozlov is eliminated?" Maria asked. "Intelligence believes that Kozlov is the primary tactical mind behind the siege strategy," Colonel Mendoza replied. "His second-in-command is competent but lacks Kozlov's experience with siege warfare. More importantly, Kozlov has been personally coordinating the positioning of forces and the timing of attacks. Without his direct leadership, we believe the siege lines would become less coordinated, potentially creating opportunities for a relief force to break through." Maria spent the rest of that day studying every piece of intelligence available about the target area. She analyzed satellite photographs, studied weather patterns, and reviewed detailed reports from reconnaissance teams that had observed the siege from a distance. She calculated potential shooting positions, estimated ranges, and planned infiltration routes that might allow her to reach an effective firing position without detection. The mission planning revealed just how difficult this assignment would be. The optimal shooting position appeared to be a rocky outcropping approximately 1,650 meters from Kozlov's command post, but reaching that position would require Maria to move through at least 3 kilometers of enemy-controlled territory. The approach would need to be made at night, and she would need to remain hidden throughout the following day until the opportunity for the shot presented itself. Maria's spotter for this mission would be Sergeant Luis Morales, a veteran reconnaissance specialist with extensive experience in deep penetration operations behind enemy lines. Sergeant Morales had volunteered for the mission despite understanding its extreme danger, motivated by the fact that his younger brother was among the soldiers trapped inside Fort Esperanza. The night before the mission, Maria performed her equipment checks with the methodical precision that had become second nature during her training. Her rifle was a highly modified precision weapon capable of accurate fire at extreme distances, equipped with an advanced telescopic sight and carefully matched ammunition. Every component had been tested and verified multiple times. She also carried specialized camouflage gear designed for the rocky terrain around the siege area, emergency medical supplies, and enough food and water to sustain her for up to 3 days if the extraction was delayed. The total weight of her equipment was significant, but she had trained extensively with similar loads during sniper school. The infiltration began at 0200 hours under a moonless sky that provided excellent concealment but made navigation challenging. Maria and Sergeant Morales moved slowly through the darkness, following a route that intelligence had determined offered the best combination of concealment and navigability. The first phase of the infiltration took them through forest terrain that provided good cover, but was filled with natural obstacles that slowed their progress. They had to navigate around fallen trees, rocky outcroppings, and areas of thick undergrowth that could not be passed through quietly. Every step had to be planned carefully to avoid making noise that might alert enemy patrols. After 2 hours of careful movement, they reached the edge of the forest and faced the most dangerous part of their approach. To reach the shooting position, they would need to cross approximately 1 kilometer of open terrain that was periodically patrolled by enemy reconnaissance teams. Intelligence had provided information about patrol schedules, but Maria and Sergeant Morales knew that any changes to enemy routines could result in their detection and capture. They waited at the forest edge for nearly an hour, observing the open area through night vision equipment and confirming the timing of enemy patrols. When they were satisfied that the area was clear, they began the dangerous crossing, moving in short rushes between areas of cover while constantly watching for any sign of enemy activity. The crossing took over 3 hours to complete safely. By the time they reached the rocky terrain where Maria would establish her shooting position, dawn was beginning to break over the valley. They had less than an hour of darkness remaining to construct their hide site before enemy observation posts would be able to see movement in their area. Working with practiced efficiency, Maria and Sergeant Morales constructed a camouflaged position that would allow Maria to observe and engage Kozlov's command post while remaining invisible to enemy observers. The position was cramped and uncomfortable, but it provided the concealment necessary for survival and the stability necessary for precision shooting. As the sun rose over the valley, Maria got her first clear view of the tactical situation. Through her scope, she could see Fort Esperanza clearly, surrounded by enemy positions that looked even more formidable than they had appeared in the satellite photographs. Smoke was rising from several areas within the fort, and she could see evidence of recent mortar impacts on the defensive walls. General Kozlov's command post was visible as well, positioned on an elevated platform that gave him a commanding view of the entire siege operation. The platform was protected by sandbags and camouflage netting, but Maria could see that there was a clear line of sight from her position to the area where Kozlov would conduct his morning briefing. The distance measurement confirmed her worst fears. The range to the target was 1,687 meters, near the absolute limit of what could be considered a reasonable shot even under ideal conditions. With the wind conditions in the valley and the pressure of the combat situation, the shot would require everything she had learned, and perhaps more than a little luck. Maria and Sergeant Morales settled into their position to wait for the target to appear. They had identified their extraction route and established communication protocols with the command post. If the mission was successful, they would have approximately 10 minutes to escape the area before enemy response teams would begin searching for them. As 0730 hours approached, Maria began her pre-shot routine. She confirmed her range calculations, studied the wind flags and vegetation that would help her read wind conditions, and prepared her rifle for the shot that could change the course of the entire siege. Through her scope, she could see activity at the command post as enemy officers gathered for the morning briefing. At exactly 0730, General Kozlov emerged onto the observation platform, wearing the distinctive uniform that identified him clearly even at the extreme distance. Maria settled into her shooting position and began to control her breathing. This was the moment that everything had been leading toward. Every hour of training, every difficult decision, every challenge she had overcome had brought her to this place and this moment. The wind was swirling unpredictably through the valley, requiring her to make constant adjustments to her aim point. At 1687 meters, even a slight miscalculation would result in a complete miss. She would have only one opportunity to take this shot before the enemy response would make her position untenable. As General Kozlov moved to his customary position at the edge of the observation platform, Maria made her final calculations and prepared to take the shot that would either save the defenders of Fort Esperanza or end her own life in the attempt. Through her scope, Maria watched General Kozlov move into position for his morning briefing. At 1687 meters, he appeared as a small figure, barely distinguishable from the other officers gathered around the observation platform. The morning sun was creating thermals that made the air shimmer slightly, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible shot. Sergeant Morales lay beside her, monitoring the area for any signs that their position had been detected, while providing wind readings and range confirmations. His voice was calm and professional as he whispered the information Maria needed. Wind is variable, 3 to 5 knots from the southwest, gusting occasionally to 8 knots. Target is stationary, range confirmed at 1687. Maria had spent the past hour studying the wind patterns in the valley, watching the movement of grass, leaves, and debris, to understand how the air currents behaved in the complex terrain. The wind was the most unpredictable variable in the shot. At this extreme distance, even a slight miscalculation could cause her bullet to miss by several feet. Her breathing had slowed to the deep, controlled pattern she had mastered during training. Her heart rate was steady, despite the enormous pressure of the situation. Everything around her seemed to fade away as she entered the focused state that her grandfather had taught her to find, where the only things that existed were herself, her rifle, and the target. Through her scope, she could see Kozlov clearly now. He was pointing at a map spread across a table on the observation platform, apparently discussing tactical positions with his staff officers. Maria could see his profile as he gestured toward Fort Esperanza, and for a moment she was struck by the reality that she was about to take a human life. But then she thought about the 1,200 civilians trapped inside the fort, including children who were suffering from malnutrition and disease. She thought about the soldiers who were dying from treatable injuries because medical supplies had run out. She thought about the families who would never be reunited if this siege continued. Maria made her final calculations for the shot. At 1,687 meters, her bullet would take approximately 2 seconds to reach the target, dropping nearly 40 feet during its flight. The wind would push the bullet several feet to the left, requiring her to aim significantly to the right to compensate. She also had to account for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, which would influence the bullet's path over such an extreme distance. The mathematics were complex, but Maria had practiced these calculations hundreds of times during training. More importantly, she had developed an intuitive understanding of ballistics that allowed her to make adjustments based on conditions that couldn't be precisely quantified. General Kozlov moved slightly, taking a position that gave Maria the clearest possible shot. He was standing at the edge of the observation platform, clearly visible and stationary as he studied the map in front of him. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Maria settled into her final shooting position, her cheek pressed firmly against the stock of her rifle, her eye aligned perfectly with the scope. Her finger moved to the trigger, applying the steady pressure that would release the shot. Everything had to be perfect. Her position, her breathing, her trigger control, and her mental focus. The world around her became absolutely silent. She could no longer hear the distant sounds of the siege, the occasional crack of sniper fire from other positions, or even Sergeant Morales breathing beside her. Her entire universe had condensed to the small circle of her scope and the figure of General Kozlov within it. She made one final adjustment for a slight change in wind direction, then settled into the shot. Her breathing stopped at the natural pause between breaths. Her trigger finger began its final squeeze, and Maria fired. The recoil of the rifle was familiar and controlled, exactly as she had practiced thousands of times. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's path across the valley, a flight that seemed to take forever but lasted only 2 seconds. At such an extreme distance, she could actually see the bullet's trajectory as it arced through the air towards its target. The impact was devastating and precise. General Kozlov collapsed instantly, struck in the center of his chest by a bullet that had traveled over a mile to reach its target with perfect accuracy. The other officers on the observation platform scattered in panic, some diving for cover, while others rushed to their fallen commander. "Target down," Sergeant Morales whispered, already beginning to pack their equipment for the immediate extraction. "Beautiful shot. Time to go." Maria felt a complex mix of emotions as she watched the chaos erupting around Kozlov's command post. There was satisfaction at having executed the most difficult shot of her life perfectly, but also the sobering weight of having taken a human life. She had no time to process these feelings fully, however, as their immediate survival depended on escaping the area before enemy search teams could locate their position. The extraction was harrowing. Within minutes of the shot, enemy patrols were scouring the area, searching for the sniper who had just eliminated their commanding general. Helicopters appeared overhead, and Maria could hear the sounds of vehicles moving rapidly through the valley as the enemy response intensified. Maria and Sergeant Morales moved quickly but carefully through the rocky terrain, following their predetermined escape route while avoiding the increasing enemy presence in the area. They had to hide twice when enemy search teams passed close to their position, remaining absolutely motionless while soldiers searched the rocks around them. The journey back to friendly lines took over 6 hours, far longer than originally planned due to the intense enemy search efforts. When they finally reached the forward operations base, Colonel Mendoza was waiting with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "Santos, I don't know how you made that shot, but you may have just broken the siege," she said. "Our intelligence sources inside the enemy lines report that Kozlov's death has created complete chaos in their command structure. His second-in-command has been trying to maintain the siege, but without Kozlov's tactical expertise, their coordination is breaking down. Indeed, the effects of Kozlov's elimination became apparent within hours. The precisely coordinated siege that had trapped Fort Esperanza for over a month began to unravel, as enemy units struggled to operate without their commander's tactical direction. Disagreements broke out among the surviving enemy officers about how to proceed, and the tight coordination that had made the siege so effective began to collapse. 2 days after Maria's shot, a relief force was able to break through the enemy lines and reach Fort Esperanza. The enemy forces, now operating without effective leadership and coordination, were unable to respond effectively to the multi-pronged attack that the relief force employed. After 38 days of siege, the defenders and civilians trapped inside the fort were finally free. The rescue revealed the true horror of what the siege had inflicted on those trapped inside. Dozens of civilians had died from disease and malnutrition, and many of the soldiers were in critical condition from untreated wounds. Medical personnel who arrived with the relief force worked frantically to save lives and treat the conditions that had developed during the long siege. Maria visited Fort Esperanza 3 days after the siege was broken, wanting to see for herself the results of her mission. Walking through the fort, she met some of the civilians who had been trapped inside, including families with young children who had survived only because of the courage and sacrifice of the defending soldiers. An elderly woman named Carmen Rodriguez approached Maria as she toured the civilian shelters. Carmen had lost her husband during the siege but had managed to keep her 3 grandchildren alive through the worst of the crisis. "Are you the sniper who ended the siege?" Carmen asked quietly. Maria nodded, not sure how to respond to the question. Carmen took Maria's hands in her own weathered ones and looked directly into her eyes.
"Thank you," she said simply.
"Because of what you did, these children will live to grow up. Their parents will come home from the war. Families will be reunited. You gave us back our future." The words hit Maria harder than she had expected. For the first time since taking the shot, she fully understood the human impact of her actions. It wasn't just about military tactics or strategic objectives. Her shot had saved real people, families who would now have the chance to rebuild their lives. Maria's successful mission had effects that reached far beyond Fort Esperanza. The enemy's failure to maintain the siege represented a significant strategic defeat that forced them to reconsider their entire approach to the war. The loss of an experienced commander like Kozlov, combined with the demonstration that their leadership was vulnerable even in supposedly secure positions, had a demoralizing effect on enemy forces throughout the region. For Maria personally, the mission established her reputation as one of the most skilled snipers in the military. The 687-meter shot under combat conditions was recognized as one of the longest successful sniper engagements on record, and her tactical execution of the entire mission became a case study taught in military academies. But Maria's proudest moment came several months later when she received a letter from her former student, Isabella Martinez, whom she had taught in the village school before joining the military. Isabella was now 12 years old and was writing to tell her teacher about how she had inspired her to pursue her own dreams, despite the challenges she faced. "Dear Miss Santos," the letter read, "my father told me about what you did to save the people in Fort Esperanza. He said you were just a small teacher from our village, but you became a hero because you never gave up on what you believed in. I want to be like you someday. I want to show people that even someone small can do big things if they work hard enough and believe in themselves." Sitting in her barracks and reading Isabella's letter, Maria thought back to that day in San Miguel when she had first volunteered to become a sniper. Everyone had said she would fail, that she was too small, too weak, too inexperienced for such demanding work. Even she had moments of doubt about whether she could succeed in such a challenging field. But her grandfather's words had proven true. Sometimes the most important ability is seeing what others cannot see. Maria had seen possibilities that others missed, had found strength in places others didn't think to look, and had achieved something that conventional wisdom said was impossible. The war continued for several more months, but the enemy's capacity for siege warfare had been severely damaged by the loss of commanders like Kozlov and the tactical lessons learned from their failures. Maria continued to serve as a sniper, but the Fort Esperanza mission remained the defining moment of her military career. Years later, after the war had ended and Maria had returned to teaching in her village school, she would sometimes take her students to the mountains where her grandfather had first taught her to shoot. She would tell them about the importance of persistence, precision, and believing in yourself even when others doubt your abilities. "Remember," she would tell them, looking out over the same valleys where she had once hunted with her grandfather, "it's not about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about seeing clearly, thinking carefully, and having the courage to act when the moment is right. Sometimes one person doing one thing perfectly can change everything." The students would listen to their teacher's stories with wide eyes, not fully understanding the profound courage it had taken for the quiet woman in front of them to make the shot that ended a siege and saved hundreds of lives. But they understood that Maria Santos, who everyone said would never make it, had proven that determination and skill could overcome any obstacle. And in her heart, Maria knew that her grandfather would have been proud of how she had used the gifts he had taught her to see what others could not see.